In the quiet farmlands of rural Michigan, where cornfields stretch toward the horizon and the nearest neighbor might be a mile away, there exists a phenomenon that has disturbed residents for decades. It begins with lights, strange, pulsing orbs that drift through the darkness. But the lights themselves are not what makes this case so unsettling. It's what comes after them, the voices. They call out from empty fields. They whisper from darkened barns. They mimic the voices of loved ones with disturbing accuracy. And for those who have experienced them, the terror is absolute. This is not legend. This is not folklore passed down through generations. These are documented accounts from ordinary people whose lives were forever changed by something they cannot explain. Northern Michigan's agricultural heartland has always been a place of isolation. The townships of Missaukee, Osceola, and Wexford counties are home to sprawling dairy farms, fields of corn and soybeans, and families who have worked the same land for generations. The soil is rich, the winters are brutal, and the nights are impossibly dark. It is in this darkness that the phenomenon thrives. The region's history is one of transformation and loss. In the late 1800s, massive logging operations stripped the area of its old-growth forests. White pine and hardwood trees that had stood for centuries were felled in a matter of decades. The lumber barons grew rich while the land was left scarred and depleted. By the early 1900s, the forests were gone, replaced by stump-filled wastelands that stretched for miles. Farmers moved in, clearing the stumps and breaking the soil. They built their homesteads on land that had been fundamentally altered by human activity. Some researchers believe this disruption of the land may be relevant to the phenomenon. The forests that once covered the region were considered sacred by the indigenous peoples who lived there long before European settlement. The Odawa and Ojibwe tribes spoke of spirits that dwelled in the deep woods, lights that moved between the trees, voices that could mimic animal calls and human speech. When the forests were destroyed, did something ancient lose its habitat? Did it adapt to the new landscape of open fields and isolated farms? There are no definitive answers, but the pattern is suggestive. Many of the farms that experience the phenomenon sit on land that was once densely forested. Soil samples taken from affected properties sometimes reveal unusual compositions, high concentrations of quartz and other crystalline minerals, magnetic anomalies, underground water sources that create complex electromagnetic fields. Whether these factors contribute to the phenomenon or merely coincide with it remains unknown. The first documented case emerged in the summer of 1978. Robert Finley was a third-generation dairy farmer who owned 240 acres outside the town of Merritt. His farm sat at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by dense woods on three sides. Robert lived there with his wife Patricia and their two teenage sons. They were practical people, skeptical of ghost stories and superstition. That changed on the night of the 14th of August. Robert was in the milking parlor around 9:30 inches the evening when he saw the first light. It appeared near the tree line at the edge of his property, about 200 yards from the barn. At first he assumed it was a flashlight, perhaps a hunter trespassing on his land. But as he watched, the light began to move in ways that defied explanation. It bobbed and weaved through the air, rising and falling in smooth arcs. It pulsed with a dull orange glow that seemed to breathe. Robert stepped outside to get a better look. The August night was warm and still. Cicadas buzzed in the trees. The light continued its strange dance, and then it stopped. It hung motionless in the air for several seconds before slowly drifting toward the barn. Robert felt his stomach tighten. Something about the light felt wrong, unnatural. Then he heard the voice. "Robert." It came from the direction of the light, clear and unmistakable. It was Patricia's voice. His wife was calling to him from the darkness, but Patricia was inside the house. Robert had seen her there not 15 minutes earlier. She had been washing dishes in the kitchen. "Robert, come here." The voice was insistent now, patient. It carried across the open ground with perfect clarity, despite the distance. Robert stood frozen. Every instinct told him not to respond, not to move toward that light. But the voice was so familiar, so completely his wife's voice, that part of him wanted to believe she had somehow walked out into the field without him noticing. He turned and ran back to the house. Patricia was still in the kitchen. She looked up from the sink, startled by his sudden entrance. Robert struggled to find words. When he finally explained what he had heard, Patricia's face went pale. She had been inside the entire time. She had not called his name. Together, they stood at the kitchen window and watched the light. It drifted back toward the woods, slowly fading until it disappeared completely. Neither of them slept well that night. Robert kept checking the doors and windows, making sure everything was locked. He could not shake the feeling that something had tried to lure him into the darkness. The next occurrence happened 3 nights later. Robert was awakened around 2:00 the morning by the sound of his oldest son calling for help. The voice was frantic, terrified. It came from somewhere outside the house. Robert bolted upright, his heart pounding. He grabbed his shotgun from the closet and rushed to his son's bedroom. His son was asleep in his bed. Robert woke him. "Were you just outside?" he asked. His son was confused, disoriented. "No," he said, "I've been asleep." But the voice had been so real, so genuine. Robert searched the property with a flashlight but found nothing. No footprints, no signs of disturbance, only silence and darkness. Over the following weeks, the phenomenon intensified. The lights appeared almost every night, sometimes multiple times. They would manifest near the barn, in the cornfield, along the tree line, and always there were voices, Patricia's voice calling from the darkness, the boys' voices pleading for help. On one occasion, Robert even heard his own voice speaking to him from across the yard, as if he was somehow talking to himself. The family began to unravel. Sleep became difficult. The boys were afraid to go outside after dark. Patricia developed severe anxiety. Robert started drinking more than he should. They contacted the local sheriff, but what could they report? Strange lights and disembodied voices? The deputy who came to the farm was polite but clearly skeptical. He suggested it might be pranksters from town, kids playing tricks. But Robert knew better. This was not a prank. In September of that year, Robert made a decision. He set up a tape recorder in the barn and left it running all night. The next morning, he played back the recording. What he heard made his blood run cold. At approximately 1:17 the morning, there was the sound of footsteps on gravel. Then, clearly and distinctly, his own voice speaking. "Patricia, are you out here?" A pause. "I need your help with something." But Robert had been asleep in his bed at that time. The voice on the tape was his, but he had never spoken those words. The recording captured something that should not exist, a perfect replication of his voice, speaking independently of him. Robert kept that tape for years. He played it for friends, neighbors, anyone who would listen. Some believed him, most did not. But those who heard it could not deny the unsettling quality of the recording. The voice sounded natural, human, yet there was something subtly wrong about it. A flatness in the tone, a lack of warmth. The Finley family sold their farm in 1981 and moved to Grand Rapids. Robert never spoke publicly about what happened on that property, but before he died in 2003, he gave an interview to a local paranormal research group. He described the lights as intelligent, purposeful. He believed they were studying his family, learning their voices, their patterns. For what reason, he could not say. Robert Finley's case was not isolated. In 1983, a similar series of events unfolded on a farm near Lake City, roughly 30 miles to the south. Dorothy Marsh was a widow who lived alone on a small cattle ranch. She was 67 years old, tough and independent. She had lived on that land for over 40 years and had never experienced anything unusual. That changed in October. Dorothy first saw the lights while feeding her cattle in the early evening. 3 of them appeared simultaneously, hovering above the far pasture. They glowed with a pale blue luminescence that reminded her of foxfire, the bioluminescent fungus that sometimes appeared on rotting wood. But these lights were not on the ground. They floated in the air, roughly 6 feet off the earth, moving in slow, deliberate patterns. Dorothy watched them for several minutes. Then one of the lights detached from the group and began moving toward her. She felt a sudden wave of fear. Something primal and instinctual told her to get inside. She hurried back to the farmhouse and locked the door. The light followed her. It stopped just outside the kitchen window, hovering at eye level. Dorothy stood in the darkened room, staring at it. The light pulsed gently, rhythmically, like a heartbeat. Then she heard the voice. Dot. It was her late husband's voice. Thomas had died 8 years earlier from a heart attack, but there was no mistaking that voice. It was his, the nickname he had always used for her, the particular way he drew out the vowel. Dot, open the door. Dorothy's hands trembled. For a moment, a terrible, irrational hope surged through her. What if it was him? What if somehow, impossibly, Thomas had come back? But the rational part of her mind knew better. This was not her husband. This was something else. Something wearing his voice like a mask. Please, Dot, I'm cold. The light pressed closer to the window. Dorothy could see her reflection in the glass, illuminated by the blue glow. She looked old, frightened. Behind her, the kitchen was dark and empty. She felt utterly alone. She did not open the door. The light remained outside her window for nearly an hour before finally drifting away. Dorothy sat at her kitchen table, shaking, unable to process what had just happened. She had heard her dead husband's voice. Something had mimicked him perfectly. But why? What did it want? The following night, the lights returned. This time there were 4 of them, spread across her property, and the voices multiplied. She heard Thomas calling to her from the barn. She heard her father's voice, though he had been dead for 20 years. She heard her childhood friend Margaret, who had died in a car accident in 1952, all of them calling to her, all of them asking her to come outside. Dorothy refused. She contacted her local priest, Father Samuel Harrington, who came to the farm and performed a blessing. The priest was a skeptic by nature, but he could see the genuine terror in Dorothy's eyes. He blessed the house, the land, and prayed with her. For 2 nights, the lights did not return. Dorothy began to hope it was over. On the 3rd night, they came back with a vengeance. Dorothy counted at least a dozen lights surrounding her property. The voices were so numerous and overlapping that they created a cacophony of sound. Men, women, children. Some she recognized, most she did not. They called to her from every direction. Some pleaded, some demanded. Some whispered her name over and over in an endless loop. Dorothy spent that night huddled in her bedroom, a shotgun across her lap, praying until dawn. When the sun finally rose, the lights vanished and the voices ceased. But something inside Dorothy had broken. She could no longer live on that farm. Within a month, she had sold the property and moved into town. She lived with her daughter for the remaining years of her life and never returned to that land. In interviews conducted years later, Dorothy maintained that the voices were not simply mimicking the dead. She believed they were trying to learn, to understand human speech and emotion by copying it. She described the voices as having a hollow quality, as if they were being spoken by something that did not fully comprehend the meaning behind the words. Throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, similar reports emerged from farms across northern Michigan. The phenomenon seemed concentrated in a specific geographic area, roughly centered around the townships of Merritt, Lake City, and Marion. Investigators who studied these cases noted several consistent elements. The lights always appeared at night. They were most common during the late summer and autumn months. They exhibited unusual movement patterns that defied natural explanation, and almost always they were accompanied by voices. These were not random sounds or indistinct whispers. These were clear, articulate voices that spoke in full sentences. They mimicked specific individuals with remarkable accuracy: family members, neighbors, even people who had been dead for years. The voices would call out names, ask questions, make requests. They seemed designed to elicit a response, to lure people out into the darkness. In 1994, a team of paranormal researchers from Michigan State University decided to investigate. Dr. Ellen Pritchard was a professor of folklore and cultural anthropology who had heard about the phenomenon through rural informants. She assembled a small research team and spent 3 weeks interviewing witnesses and examining affected properties. What she discovered challenged her understanding of unexplained phenomena. Dr. Pritchard's team documented 27 separate incidents across 5 counties. They collected audio recordings, conducted electromagnetic field measurements, and performed soil analysis on sites where the lights had been seen. The results were inconclusive but troubling. The audio recordings captured voices that could not be traced to any human source. The electromagnetic readings showed unusual spikes at locations where lights had appeared. The soil samples revealed nothing abnormal. What struck Dr. Pritchard most was the psychological impact on the witnesses. These were not people prone to fantasy or exaggeration. They were farmers, teachers, mechanics, practical individuals with no prior interest in the paranormal. Yet their accounts were remarkably consistent. They described the lights in nearly identical terms. They all reported feeling an overwhelming sense of wrongness when the voices spoke. Many suffered from lasting psychological effects: anxiety, sleep disorders, an inability to be alone after dark. Dr. Pritchard concluded her research with more questions than answers. In her published report, she wrote, "The phenomenon documented in northern Michigan represents a genuine anomaly that warrants further study. Whether the lights and voices are a natural occurrence, a technological phenomenon, or something else entirely remains unknown. What is clear is that numerous credible witnesses have experienced something that profoundly disturbed them. We would be remiss to dismiss their accounts without rigorous investigation. The phenomenon continues to this day, though reported incidents have become less frequent. In 2007, a young couple named Marcus and Jennifer Holbrook purchased a farmhouse near Evart. They were unaware of the area's history. Within weeks of moving in, they began experiencing the lights. Jennifer saw them first, hovering over the cornfield behind their property. Then came the voices. Marcus heard his own voice calling to him from the barn. Jennifer heard her deceased grandmother speaking to her in the middle of the night. The Holbrooks documented their experiences on video. The footage shows strange orbs of light moving across their property in ways that cannot be easily explained. Wind patterns do not affect them. They pass through solid objects. At one point, the camera's audio captures a voice that sounds remarkably similar to Marcus, though he was holding the camera at the time. The couple abandoned the property after 6 months. They simply walked away, leaving most of their possessions behind. In an interview posted online, Marcus stated, "We couldn't stay there. Every night those lights would come. And the voices, they knew things, personal things. It felt like something was trying to get inside our heads." Between the documented cases lie dozens more that never made it into official reports. Farmers who refused to speak publicly about their experiences. Families who left their land without explanation. In 1989, an entire property outside Marion sat abandoned for 3 years before anyone would purchase it. The previous owners had fled in the middle of the night, leaving dishes on the table and clothes in the closets. When questioned by authorities, they would only say that something had been calling to them from the fields, something that knew their names. Local folklore in the region has attempted to explain the lights through various means. Some say the land was cursed by Native Americans who were displaced during the logging boom of the 1800s. Others claim the lights are the spirits of lumberjacks who died in the forests, forever searching for their way home. The Odawa people who originally inhabited the region have their own stories about lights in the forest, though these predate European settlement by centuries. They spoke of wandering spirits who could steal a person's voice and use it to confuse travelers. But these folkloric explanations feel inadequate when confronted with the specificity of modern accounts. The lights do not simply appear randomly, they seem to target certain properties, certain families. Investigators have noted that farms which experience the phenomenon often share certain characteristics. They tend to be isolated. They are frequently near bodies of water or wetlands. Many sit on land that was cleared from old-growth forest. Whether these factors are relevant or merely coincidental remains unclear. In 1998, a team of electrical engineers from the University of Michigan attempted a different approach to understanding the lights. They installed monitoring equipment on a farm that had reported repeated incidents. Motion sensors, infrared cameras, electromagnetic field detectors, and sensitive microphones were positioned around the property. The equipment ran continuously for 6 weeks. The results were both fascinating and frustrating. The cameras captured the lights on multiple occasions. They appeared as spherical objects approximately 2 to 3 feet in diameter, glowing with various colors ranging from pale blue to orange-red. The lights moved with deliberate purpose, often following paths that seemed to avoid the monitoring equipment itself. On 3 separate occasions, the motion sensors detected movement where the cameras showed nothing visible. The electromagnetic readings were particularly strange. Each time the lights appeared, there was a corresponding spike in the electromagnetic field, but the pattern was unlike anything natural. The spikes followed a rhythmic pulse that one engineer described as almost biological. The frequency ranged between 7 and 13 Hz, overlapping with human brainwave patterns. But it was the audio recordings that proved most disturbing. The microphones captured voices on 17 separate occasions. The voices were clear, articulate, and in every case, they matched the vocal patterns of people who lived on the farm or had recently visited. The family's youngest daughter, aged 12, had her voice recorded speaking phrases she had never said. The farmer himself heard his own voice discussing topics he had no memory of mentioning. The voices seemed to emerge from nowhere, with no detectable source. One recording captured a conversation between 2 voices that sounded identical to the farmer and his wife. They were discussing their plans to sell the farm and move to Florida, except that the couple was not on the property at the time of the recording. They were in town, having dinner with friends. When they listened to the recording later, they confirmed that they had discussed selling the farm, but that conversation had taken place inside their house, behind closed doors, 2 days before the recording was made. How could the voices know this? How could they replicate not just the sound of their voices, but the content of their private discussions? The research team had no answers. Their final report noted, "The phenomenon documented at this location exhibits characteristics inconsistent with known natural occurrences. The lights display apparent intelligence and purposeful behavior. The associated vocalizations cannot be explained through conventional means. Further study is recommended, though we acknowledge the difficulty in conducting such research given the unpredictable nature of the events." Another aspect of the phenomenon that troubles investigators is its effect on animals. Dogs refuse to go near areas where the lights have appeared. Cattle become agitated when the lights are present, often breaking through fences in their attempts to flee. Horses will not enter fields that have been visited by the lights, even days after an occurrence. Birds fall silent when the lights appear, and the normal nighttime chorus of insects ceases completely. This reaction from animals suggests that the lights emit something imperceptible to humans, a frequency of sound beyond our hearing range, an electromagnetic signal that animals can detect. Whatever it is, it triggers a deep, instinctual fear response in wildlife. They recognize the lights as a threat, even if they cannot understand what that threat represents. There have been attempts to communicate with the phenomenon, In 2003, a paranormal research group set up equipment on a property and actively tried to engage with the lights. They used voice recorders, asking questions into the darkness. The lights appeared, as they often did on that property. The researchers documented their attempts at communication, asking the lights to respond by moving in specific patterns or by making sounds. The lights did respond, but not in the way the researchers expected. Instead of answering their questions, the lights began mimicking their voices. Within minutes of the researchers speaking, they heard their own words being repeated back to them. But the repetitions were not exact. The lights would take phrases the researchers had said and rearrange them, creating new sentences from the borrowed vocabulary. One researcher named Daniel Kowalski asked, "What are you? Where do you come from?" Minutes later, he heard his own voice in the darkness saying, "You come from where? What are you?" The words were his, but the order was scrambled. It was as if something was learning the components of language but did not yet understand grammar or meaning. The experience left Kowalski deeply unsettled. In his notes he wrote, "It felt like we were teaching it, like every word we spoke was being absorbed and analyzed. I realized we might be helping it become better at mimicking us. We left immediately and have not returned." This raises a troubling question. Is the phenomenon learning from each encounter? Are the voices becoming more sophisticated over time? Early accounts from the 1970s and 1980s described voices that were often somewhat stilted or mechanical. Modern accounts suggest the voices have become more natural, more convincing. If this is true, then what happens when the mimicry becomes perfect? When there is no way to distinguish the voice of the phenomenon from a genuine human voice? Some witnesses report experiencing what they describe as false memories after encounters with the lights. They recall conversations that never happened. They remember seeing people in places where those people could not have been. These memory distortions are subtle but persistent. One man described looking at family photographs and suddenly remembering his father being present at an event, only to realize later that his father had died before that event took place. He was certain he had seen his father there. The memory felt real, but it was impossible. Could the lights be affecting not just sound, but perception, memory? If they can replicate voices, could they also implant false recollections? The implications are deeply disturbing. It suggests the phenomenon is not merely mimicking humans from the outside, but potentially manipulating human consciousness itself. Dr. Laura Henderson, a neurologist who has studied several witnesses, noted unusual patterns in their brain scans. Subjects who had experienced the phenomenon showed increased activity in the temporal lobe, an area associated with memory and auditory processing. Some exhibited slight abnormalities in their hippocampus, the region responsible for forming new memories. Dr. Henderson was careful to note that correlation does not imply causation, but the findings were consistent across multiple subjects who had never met and lived in different locations. "We cannot definitively say the lights caused these changes," Dr. Henderson stated in an interview, "but the pattern is suggestive. Something is affecting the way these individuals process sound and memory. Whether that is psychological trauma from the experience or a direct effect of the phenomenon itself, we cannot currently determine." Skeptics have attempted to explain the phenomenon through various natural means: swamp gas, temperature inversions, electrical storms, ball lightning, the piezoelectric effect from crystalline rocks in the soil. But none of these explanations adequately account for the voices. Natural phenomena do not mimic human speech with such precision. They do not call out specific names or engage in conversation. Some researchers have proposed more exotic theories. Could the lights be some form of plasma-based life? An electromagnetic intelligence that has learned to manipulate sound waves? Others have suggested interdimensional intrusions, brief overlaps between our reality and another. The voices might be echoes of people from parallel timelines, bleeding through into our world. There are darker theories as well. Some believe the lights are predatory in nature, that they use the voices to lure people into dangerous situations. There have been cases where individuals followed the voices into the woods and became disoriented, lost for hours in terrain they should have known well. A few never returned. Their disappearances remain officially unsolved, though locals whisper about the lights. What makes the Michigan farm lights particularly disturbing is their apparent intelligence. These are not random occurrences. The lights seem to observe, to learn, to adapt. They target specific individuals. They use information that should not be accessible. In several documented cases, the voices spoke about private conversations that had taken place inside homes, far from where the lights were observed. How could they know these things? Perhaps the most chilling aspect is the mimicry itself. The voices are too perfect. They capture not just the sound of a person's voice, but the cadence, the accent, the particular way certain words are pronounced. They replicate emotional tones, affection, fear, urgency. Yet beneath the surface, witnesses report sensing something fundamentally wrong, an absence of genuine emotion, a performance so meticulous that it reveals itself as artificial. Robert Finley, in his final interview before his death, was asked what he believed the lights were. He paused for a long time before answering. Then he said, "I think they're trying to understand us, like a child learning to speak by repeating what it hears. But they don't have the context, they don't know what the words mean, they're just copying the sounds." And that's what makes them so dangerous, because they sound human, but they're not. The farmlands of northern Michigan remain quiet. The corn grows, the cattle graze, families go about their lives. But on certain nights, when the darkness is complete and the air is still, the lights return. They drift through the fields. They hover near barns and fence lines, and if you listen carefully, you might hear a voice calling out. A familiar voice, someone you know, someone you love. But before you answer, before you step outside into that darkness, ask yourself one question. Are you certain it's really them? The phenomenon persists, the questions remain unanswered, and somewhere in the rural darkness of Michigan, the lights continue their vigil, waiting, watching, learning to speak with borrowed voices. If you've had a similar experience, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of Michigan's most persistent mysteries, please consider subscribing to the channel. There are more stories like this waiting to be told. Stories that blur the line between the known and the unknowable. Stories that remind us that even in our modern world, some things remain beyond our understanding. Until next time, sleep well.